There's an old apocryphal saying that traces back to Britain in the 1930s. May you live in interesting times. Well, guys, we're living in interesting times. I'm going to steer away from all the other things and focus on something significantly less important, and that's college athletics. Hi, welcome to my channel. College athletics has changed dramatically in just the last 6 or 7 years, so much so that it's blown every other change before it out of the water. Let's just go from a rough timeline here. In around 2019, laws on name, image, and likeness created opportunities for college athletes to receive benefits for their, name, image, and likeness. At around the same time, the transfer portal expanded to allow athletes more freedom in when and where they moved if they wanted to transfer. Cut to 2020, and the plague rendered a lot of seasons shortened. Significant acts of realignment created 2 super conferences in the Big Ten and SEC, nearly killed the Big 12, and stripped the Pac-12 of its power conference status, and the effects of that are still echoing today. But, just a few weeks ago, yet another bombshell hit the college sports landscape, and it's likely the biggest event to happen in college sports since NCAA versus Oklahoma Board of Regents in 1984. We are witnessing quite possibly the most important event in college sports history right now in the fallout of the House versus NCAA lawsuit. This won't just fundamentally change college sports, it will change the way college sports are done forever going forward. And if you're like me, this is something that has sometimes interested you, sometimes scared you, and continuously confused you. For the most part, my channel covers college sports history. I look at realignment, its effects on schools, and sometimes individual stories, but it's all in the past. Even the stuff I make about the future is all opinion, based on what we know about the past, and none of it really delves into the legal aspects of anything behind the scenes. The House settlement is simultaneously the most important event in college sports history, in my eyes anyway, and something I am absolutely nowhere near qualified to talk about. I studied English, not law. Here's what Wikipedia has to say about the House settlement as a brief overview for those of you that don't know anything about what's going on. Grant House and Sedona Prince versus National Collegiate Athletic Association et al. Is a class action lawsuit brought against the National Collegiate Athletics Association and 5 collegiate athletic conferences in which the NCAA agreed to allow its member institutions to distribute funds to Division I athletes who have played since 2016. A proposed settlement was approved from the court on June 6, 2025. I wanted to touch on this event on the channel because, it's important in the scope of college sports history. But, like I said before, I don't really think I'm qualified to talk about it, what it is, and what it could mean for the future of college sports. But luckily for me, I do know someone who knows more than I do. My good friend Ace from the Aggieville Alley Cats podcast. Now, aside from being a sports nut and one of the best memers I know, Ace is also studying law with a vested interest in sports. He asked to borrow my channel as a platform to talk about the House settlement, and I thought it would be a great opportunity for not just you guys, but for me to learn about it as well. Hopefully by the end of this video, we all know a little more about the settlement, how it might affect our favorite schools. This is going to be a very different video than what I normally put out in terms of style. Since there's a lot going on in this video in terms of words, I'll just have some background video going on to keep it from being just a podcast, with occasional things being brought into frame if a visual aid is needed.
First things first, have to get this disclaimer out of the way. I'm not an attorney, and nothing I say should be treated as legal fact. This episode and the opinions therein do not represent any legal, professional, or financial advice of any kind. Any information provided in this episode is not guaranteed to be complete, adequate, current, or legally flawless in any way, shape, or form. In short, I have no legal opinion, nor is anything I say the final word on the law, and it should be not at all treated as such. But before we dive more into the nitty-gritty of the House settlement itself, there are a few questions that I feel are worth getting into sort of as just top-level questions. And to start with, probably the most common question that I've been asked about this is explain this in short, simpler terms. So the best analogy that I came up with is imagine you're working for a lemonade stand. The lemonade stand is part of a larger group of stands, and they're all able to profit off the lemonade that you sell, but you are not personally getting paid, and you're not allowed to accept tips. The lemonade stand conglomerate panics after a rule saying that the lemonade stand you work for can now pay you as much as you need for the materials to make the lemonade, and they start letting you accept tips. That makes the conglomerate very antsy. But it also upsets a bunch of old employees that say they never got that same opportunity. The conglomerate, once again, panics and starts saying that the lemonade stands must pay out their profits to people selling the lemonade and that they can accept tips. This is the basics of a revenue sharing model. The athletes were representing the university on the field, but were not allowed to accept tips, at being NIL money, or collect the salary outside of their scholarship. But another important question that people ask about this new system set up by the House settlement is, will it stand? Does it have staying power? In its current form, it's only supposed to exist for 10 years, which was a similar time to how the NBA was set up during its settlement agreement, which ended up setting for restricted free agency and the modern free agency system that has the salary cap. The main issue that people seem here and why people seem to think that the system will fall apart comes down to one of the NIL standards being fair market value and the other being how it applies only to D1 schools, as well as the revenue sharing cap. To start with the overarching theme, anything that would have to do with a legal challenge would have to go through what's called a rule of reason analysis. So basically, if you are restricting trade in some way, but you have a good reason for doing it, courts are going to tend to let it stand under a rule of reason analysis. So to put it very simply and as short as I can, the fair market value standard for NIL is something that's squishy enough that needs to be in place for a few years before it can be challenged. The last question that I get, or I've seen a little bit about, is about labor law. Labor law and antitrust are different forms of law. They're different laws. So the House settlement was an antitrust settlement, which means that it doesn't really interact with labor law. Without anything like a college players union, labor law doesn't really come into play. So with the short-ish version of the preliminary concerns out of the way, anything that has to do with the House settlement has to be explained through the lens of antitrust law. So antitrust law comes in the form of two acts, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. What the Sherman Act does is it prohibits contracts, combinations, or conspiracies in the restraint of trade. Whenever you have an antitrust challenge under the Sherman Act, there are two primary ways that you have to look at it through: per se illegality and the rule of reason. So per se illegality is basically just saying, hey, this is on its face a violation of the Sherman Act, and there is no justification that you could give us for why this should exist. This is for things like price fixing. But the rule of reason analysis is a little more interesting and a lot more nuanced because, like I said earlier, it is that balancing test between, yes, we are doing something that is anti-competitive or restrains trade, but we have a good reason to do it. And one of the most commonly accepted rule of reason approaches is we either do this or we die. There are three major cases that the NCAA has been a part of, at least that I'll talk about. The first one being NCAA versus Oklahoma Board of Regents, which was a case about TV contracts and the NCAA saying only this school can only be on 2 times a year, and that applied to all schools equally, which upset the University of Oklahoma as one of the biggest brands at the time, and they had it struck down. So Oklahoma was able to succeed because the NCAA was trying to put forth a restraint of trade, the trade being the brands of college football, through TV contracts, and that wasn't allowed to fly. That was pretty much the first time that the NCAA lost in court when it comes to antitrust violations. And a big reason for that was the amateurism standards that they had, which that came up a lot in the O'Bannon versus NCAA case, which was the NIL restrictions case that killed off the NCAA series of video games. And then the most recent ruling, and the one that really opened the door for the House settlement to exist from an antitrust perspective, is NCAA versus Alston, which very much cut into the amateurism defense. The amateurism defense was saying that we don't need to pay these athletes because they are amateurs. They are not employees of the university. And them not being employees remains the case under the House settlement. But what Alston did was it more closely tied the athletic departments to the universities by saying that the university or the NCAA could not in any way limit additional academic scholarships given to athletes. And that really freaked the NCAA out because they had long stood on athletics and the athletes were separate in the ways that they didn't link to the university, but together in the sense that it made them an amateur. And that's what you get with antitrust lawsuits, because a wide net of people has to have your particular problem. And in the House case, the problem was athletes not getting a fair share of pay or any pay at all. So now that we've sort of gotten the introduction part of antitrust law out of the way, we can talk about the settlement itself, which the least interesting part of the settlement is the settlement part that separates previous athletes into 3 different classes: the revenue classes, women's basketball classes, and the other class, which gets to fight over $2.6 billion in damages. But I think the more interesting part, or at least the most interesting part that everyone seems to be talking about, is how it affects current athletes and current college athletics. So the exact language of the House settlement is, quote, "In exchange for a release of claims," which, to take a pause here, means that none of these plaintiffs can bring up this antitrust claim about them not getting paid in the future. To continue the quote, "The settlement provides for billions of dollars worth of monetary relief, as well as injunctive relief that will fundamentally restructure college sports, ensuring that the student athletes can compete for compensation based on the value they provide to their universities." End quote. So the basics of the structure of the House settlement is to let the athletes get compensated to the value that they provide the university. And they also frame it in the form of injunctive relief, which, to put in the most simple terms, is just a legally binding way for a court to make someone stop doing something or to force them to do something. Division I schools can pay up to 22% of what an average Power 4 school's athletic department directly to the players, which they end up calling the pool. And the cap applies equally to all Division I schools. So Alabama's cap is going to be the exact same as St. John's cap, for example. And it's just the average of what all the Power 4 schools are making. So take every athletic department's budget and revenue share, put them together, divide it by the number of Power 4, or I think they use Power 5, but it's Power 4 now, schools, and that is the cap. So let's dive into the number that they have there, the pool, as the settlement calls it. So one of the biggest issues that people have raised is, how does this affect G5 schools? Well, the settlement actually talks about this, and G5 schools, it isn't a salary floor. So G5s will spend money. They won't be able to spend as much money, and they won't be able to spend up to the cap, almost certainly, but it's still there as an option. I think where people sort of get stuck is for the name, image, and likeness part of it. And this goes back to the fair market value standard, because NIL donors, third-party collectives can still exist, but they can only pay up to the fair market value, that is a quote, of a given player, and it has to be, quote, for a genuine business activity. Because fair market value inherently is a subjective analysis. No one is going to disagree that Arch Manning is going to command a bigger payout than someone like Mason Olgin, the long snapper for K-State. No one is going to dispute that. It's whenever you get to athletes that are somewhat comparable to one another that the standard is going to face the biggest challenges. So say you have two quarterbacks in the exact same conference. Let's just say Rocco Becht and Avery Johnson as an example. Let's say they put them in the exact like markets and everything else about them is the same. The only difference is the teams they play for and their names. What is a fair market value is entirely dependent on how much that people are willing to pay them for the name. And it would also be very difficult for an NCAA or the clearinghouse that handles the NIL payments to say no, that is an exorbitant amount for their name. So I don't want to call it fluff language, but I don't think that that's going to be a major sticking point that's going to get a lot of people rejected, and therefore it isn't going to lead to a lot of lawsuits. I could be wrong. I've been wrong several times before, but that's just my biggest guess. And the other big part of the House settlement is scholarship limits are dead. So an entire team can be entirely filled with scholarship players up to the roster limit. And roster limits, I think, will probably be handled on more conference by conference basis. I would imagine it ends up being 105, and a lot of teams don't fill that entire team with scholarship players. You'll still have some walk-ons. So, in short, what the House settlement does for current athletes is it sets up a revenue sharing model where the universities can pay up to 22% of an average athletics budget, we'll just use that term, to the players directly. NIL payments can exist so long as they are reasonable and for a business purpose, and they can't limit things like scholarships or medical care. But to the next question that everyone always has is, what's going to happen in the future? Notably, the NCAA could lobby Congress to step in and do something and pass a law, like just saying that, hey, here's the state of college athletics, here's how it's going to be, which lobbying is actually protected. But I think the most interesting avenue that might happen is sort of a college players union. And you sort of see in the opening of the door to this through big collectives that, like the college licensing, I think it's committee, but anything that allows a mass group of athletes to have their likeness be marketed. I think that the next step is probably going to be a college players union, but the other biggest question for the future is eligibility concerns, and this is another part that's discussed in the settlement. And that's eligibility questions are now going to be set up by a system of third-party arbitration. So you have an arbitrator saying who is and who isn't eligible for the sake of antitrust law. So the most obvious question that people sort of ask whenever they look at the House settlement, the biggest question is, are college athletics dead? Are college athletics as we knew them a thing of the past? And in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I still think that you are going to see a lot more loyalty in college sports than you see in things like the professional leagues. I don't think college sports is just something that's going to go away or die because they have to start paying players, or because there are these new scholarship requirements, or because of eligibility concerns. I think it's much more likely that college football survives, or college sports in general survives, because, put simply, there's far too much money in college athletics for them to fall apart. No matter what new standards get put in place, no matter how much the payout grows between universities, or even if universities have to drop down to the Division II level because they're just simply not able to keep up with the cap, all of that is still going to keep college football around. Now, whether or not this was good for college football is a value judgment I'm not going to make on this show. But I think that college football is going to survive. And I think that in some ways it will be in a very, very different way. But whenever you're watching what's on the field, I think that in a lot of ways, it will resemble what we all love about college football. Because what paying athletes or giving them more benefits or increasing scholarships or giving NIL payments to previous athletes, it doesn't affect the pageantry of college football. And maybe this is me being a romantic, and maybe this is me wanting to be far too optimistic for my favorite collection of sports. But this isn't going to kill college sports. It's going to change college sports, and it will take a lot of time to adjust, and there will be a lot of times that if you're a fan of a smaller school, it just won't feel fair. The truth is, the system was never fair. So, I hope you all enjoyed this little miniature deep dive into antitrust law and how the House settlement sort of affects it.
Hopefully you have a better idea of what the settlement is. If you're a K-State fan, be sure to subscribe to Ace and Connor over on the Aggieville Alley Cats podcast. I've been on there a few times, and we've talked about everything from realignment to quarterbacks wearing jersey numbers in the 20s. As an extra aside, remember college football season's coming up. If you have any fun trips planned, be sure to tell me in the comments below so I can live vicariously through you. I'm getting married during football season this year and won't be able to go on a big football trip. K-State history is coming through here soon, and I'm trying to get at least one more off-season style video put out before the season starts. Thanks for watching, be civil in the comments, and hey, I'll see you next time.